Good morning, everybody. Dr. Karen here. Just popping in to do this scheduled Facebook Live session where I'm going to go through and answer some of the member questions that have been coming up. So happy 4th of July week, everybody. I know that some of you are catching up on your modules and some of you are relaxing. So whatever you're doing, hopefully you'll be able to pop in and go and watch this so that you can get some of your questions answered. So we've got a couple items on the agenda today. Basically what I've done is I've taken some questions that have come up. I know I've asked you to submit some questions for me. And so if you've submitted it by last night, I've seen it and I'll take it into account whether you did it in a comment or whether you did it via email. And so we've got basically 3 items on the agenda. So what I usually do is I'll go through some of the questions that have been coming up in this Facebook group and some of the questions that have been emailed to me or people have made comments on the actual courses themselves. And then I'll go through and kind of compile them into different themes so that I make sure that I address everybody's questions that have been coming up. So some of these might have been answered in some way, shape, or form in previous lives, but I'll always go through and reiterate if they've been coming up again. And so, yeah, we've got 3 main items on the agenda today based on some of the questions that have come up. So 2 of them are clinical questions, and then the other one is about program offerings that I have and determining what program is right for you. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So item number 1, there was some questions about how to integrate phonological awareness and just where that fits into our role when we are working on vocabulary interventions. We do cover this in more depth in Language Therapy Advanced and Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. But I know that there are some follow-up questions as far as just how involved we should be in the school system. So we're going to go into that first, and then I'm going to talk about semantic feature analysis and really working through kind of a hierarchy and trying to figure out how to write goals for semantic feature analysis. So we'll address that second. And then finally, there have been some questions about program offerings, specifically about the difference between the Vocabulary Foundation and Language Therapy Advanced and Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. So I wanted to clarify some of those things and then give you the opportunity to get some additional information if you're interested in any of those programs. And then also there have been some questions about SLP Learning Academy, which is separate. So there is all of the people in this Facebook group are a member of one of my one-time courses. So this could be Language Therapy Advanced and Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, Vocabulary Foundation, Art and Science of Narrative Language, and the Social Language Roadmap. But then there is a separate group that I've just started for a different coaching program that doesn't involve any courses, but involves additional coaching where you can actually talk to me face-to-face and get more of a detailed breakdown and detailed support of specific case studies. So basically, you don't have to be in any other specific program to be involved in SLP Learning Academy. But if you are in any of the programs in this Facebook group, it's a perfect next step for you to really get help with that implementation. So I'll share all of that with you. And then I'll give you the opportunity to get more information and share how you can get more information after that. So I see some people are logging in now. So obviously we do have some items on the agenda today, but if you have other questions that come up, feel free to type them in the chat. I can answer additional questions on the fly as well. That's why we have the live option, but I know that sometimes people like to submit questions in advance. So hold on, I'm gonna just get a couple things up on my screen here. If you guys see me looking up, it's because I have a double monitor and I have some of my notes up here. It's funny, I had a Facebook Live I did a while back, and people were like, why are you looking up there? What's up there? Is there a spider up there? And people were just so confused about why I kept looking up. But yeah, let me just got a couple things I wanted to get up here on the, on my screen here, and then we'll get going. Okay, so first item on the agenda is phonological awareness. So really the question becomes, what is our role and how do we actually work on this? So, and again, if you are in Language Therapy Advanced or Language Therapy Advanced Premium, not Premium, Foundations, in the, I believe it's module 5, where we talk about morphology and go into morphology, orthography, and phonology, and talk about supporting spelling. This is really where you can get the in-depth assessment or in-depth description of how you really want to work phonological awareness in as an SLP. So there are a couple caveats to that, because the best way to do it depends on your situation. You could be a school SLP who is responsible for delivering services to 80 plus kids, and you might be delivering instruction in groups. Or you could be in private practice and have a little more flexibility, and maybe might be able to brand yourself as a literacy expert and as someone who is specialized in school age language and literacy. So obviously those two situations are going to look a lot different, but there are a couple considerations that you can make regardless, just to kind of fine tune. So really, when it comes down to phonological awareness, the key thing that you want to remember is that two skills that our students need in order to be able to accurately decode is that they need to be able to blend sounds together, and then they need to be able to segment. And not just sounds, but linguistic units. So they not only need to be able to blend those phonemes together, they also need to be able to see those pieces of linguistic information like morphemes as well. So they need to be able to have that skill of blending and segmentation, and being able to blend and segment individual sounds, or at least individual parts of words, is the way that we start to teach our students to do that in the early grades. And we can obviously be doing phonological awareness as early as preschool. I know in a lot of preschool curriculums, they don't, like, I know I'm in Illinois and they're not even supposed to be integrating print. I know that our preschool teachers in the district that I was at for many years, they would kind of sneak it in because they knew that some kids were ready for it. And so they would work it in and maybe teach the kids how to spell their names and maybe have letters throughout the room, even though it wasn't required parts of the curriculum. And then they wouldn't really get into the print exposure or really start teaching the letters and letter sound correspondences until kindergarten. But again, they would give lots of exposure and work it in. But they'd be doing things like rhyming and talking about beginning sounds and ending sounds in preschool. But really, they didn't get into the meat of phonological awareness, and that wasn't really fully integrated into the curriculum until kindergarten and first grade were the big years when that was done. And so the primary things, so again, there's lots of variations of this, but when you're thinking about what needs to be in place for phonological awareness intervention, you want kids to be able to blend. So k, at, that is cat that I just said. And then you want them to be able to segment. So cat, the sounds in that word are k, at. You want kids to be able to do that skill right there. So even things like saying k, at, doing an onset rhyme is a segmentation skill if you think about it, or even being able to identify the beginning or end sound. You still have to segment that sound off of the word. That's still a variation of blending and segmentation. And then also there are more difficult skills that you can add on as you work up the hierarchy, like sound addition, sound manipulation, like at. Now put k at the beginning of it. Now it's cat. So just those manipulation activities. So there are a lot of variations. I know that the specific curriculum that was used at my district was Heggerty. If you actually look at the probes, they're not perfect, but if you know, if you're well read on phonological awareness instruction, you can kind of figure out, and especially if you work with kids, you can kind of figure out how to modify it somewhat. So the reason I'm going into this is because when you are trying to plan intervention for kids with language disorders, you want to make sure that this is being done. And sometimes if you are a private practitioner, or if you are in a position in the schools where you have the bandwidth to be providing a tier 2 intervention, or maybe you might even be the one doing this for a student's IEP, that's great. You should definitely be working on these things directly. And if they have this, if they've been identified as needing this on their IEP, then you definitely want to include it in your goals. However, you do not have to be the one to be doing these things. So again, private practice is different because you have a lot more flexibility. But in the schools, a lot of times what's more likely to happen is that somebody else is going to be doing those direct phonological interventions, or phonological awareness interventions. So this could be maybe the general education teacher is doing those things with the whole group. Maybe somebody's doing it in a small group with the students who've been identified as needing that. The special ed teacher might be doing it. It doesn't matter if you're the one doing it. You just need to make sure someone is doing it. So a lot of times this could be, you might be consulting with those other teachers who are doing it. And so really again, we want to be flexible about the way we think of how we provide services. We want to make sure that these things are being done, but we don't always have to be the one doing it. What happened more often than not for me specifically was that I would, again, depending on the student, I would make sure that somebody was working on blending and segmentation at the level and the variation of it that the student needed, whether it be a general education teacher, whether it even maybe was a trained teaching assistant, whether it be the special education teacher, whether it be the reading specialist, someone was doing it. And then I was working on some of those other things that the student needed directly in my therapy. So this might be things more like working on semantics and working on vocabulary, working on syntax, working on morphology. And I would still emphasize phonological awareness, but I wouldn't necessarily be just sitting there doing these drills where it's like cat, put it together, because I knew that was being done elsewhere. However, what I would do is that when I was introducing words to the students, I would always make sure I did a couple things. Number one, I would make sure that I said the word and that the student said it back to me. That simple thing there, a lot of times kids don't have a good phonological representation of a word, and that's part of vocabulary. So just having them say the word back to you and making sure that they have opportunities to use and say the word during the session actually emphasizes those phonological skills. And then I'd always make sure that they would see the word in print as I was saying it, and that they would either get exposure to it or they would have to write it and use it in print or read it or something like that, so that would tie that, actually build some of that orthographic awareness and knowledge of what the word looks like. So those were things that I always made sure that I did. Now, you can take it a step further. For example, one way, and again, if you're in Language Therapy Advanced, this is the training on morphology. I walk through how to do this in depth, where you're studying both phonology and morphology. And so that's where you can get more information about that. But just to give you kind of the quick and dirty review right now, what I would do, and this is when I would do this often, is either when I was introducing a word for the first time and we were going to study it, or when maybe we were working on writing sentences or something like that, and a student would say, how do you spell that word? So this, with spelling, when you have those learning opportunities, it's a good time to reinforce a strategy with the students, because a lot of times, like, and I know that I would experience this personally, where it's like, okay, like you don't want to just tell them some generic strategy like sound it out, because everybody tells them that, and if that worked, they'd already know how to spell it. But then on the other hand, sometimes it's like, well, do I just tell them the answer? Because that doesn't really require them to think and problem solve about it. And yes, sometimes when you're kind of in a hurry, it might be okay to just be like, here's the word, write it down. But more often than not, what I would do is that I would show them some kind of a strategy for thinking about how to spell that word. So what I would do is, number one, if it had one morpheme in it, or maybe if it only had two and I thought it would be pretty easy to do with just breaking out the morphemes, I would do something like this. So I would say, let's say that they're going to spell cat. I would say, okay, let's think about the sounds and then think about the letters. Let's think about how many sounds are in that word. K, a, t. Okay, so we'd count k, at. And then as I was saying those sounds, I would draw 3 lines on a page. So now you have a visual representation of those 3 sounds on your page. You've got 3 lines on your paper. And then we go back and we think about the letters that go with the sounds. And then I would say k, a, t, and I'd write the letters that went with the sounds on those lines as I said it again. Now, of course, you might get some kids that are going to write a K for a word like this if you've got something that doesn't have a, if you've got something that isn't obvious, but then you say, okay, like that makes sense, but this is actually how you do it. And then you would model it. And if you have a word like shut, where you have the SH, then you would just show that SH goes on one line, because that sh is one sound. So that's how I would model it for them. If you've got a word that has multiple morphemes, you could do it this way with just individual phonemes, but that's a lot of information to hold in your memory. So what I would more often do, if it's a longer word, like for example, if I have the word react, I might point out that there's 2 parts to that word, react, because you've got that prefix at the beginning. And I might draw 2 lines, and then we would think about how to spell those 2 parts of that word. Now, yes, in that situation, you might have to give some support about how to spell each of those morphemes, but this way you're breaking it apart. So that's usually the strategy that I do. And it doesn't, you could drag this out for 30 minutes for one word if you wanted to, or you could model it really quickly in just a minute or 2 and then move on with your lesson. So that's usually what I would do, and that's a really good way to work it in. With phonological awareness, because there's a lot of stuff out there already, and now it's getting a lot more prevalent in the curriculums, I don't make it super complicated for SLPs in my programs, because number one, you don't have to be the one doing it, and number 2, you can really get a lot of bang for your buck with just working it in this way. And then number 3, there are a lot of things that you should be working on, or that you should be working on them because a lot of other people aren't doing them and your students need them. And just the way that it works in the school systems, sometimes you have to divide and conquer with some of those skills, where you might need to kind of think, okay, the student needs all 5 of these things. They need work on orthography, phonology, morphology, semantics, and syntax. Okay, so we've got this team of people. Who's going to work on what? And so, again, how much of that you're working on will depend on your team. But a lot of times in the schools, and I would say kind of the typical situation where you've got a lot of kids on your caseload, chances are that the general education teacher is not going to be able to do the intensive word study and work on semantics and syntax and morphology as much as your students are going to need. So you can really you can fit into that puzzle as far as being a good team member and providing the missing piece by working on those things, and then just working in morphology and orthography. And in that example that I gave with the lines, you're also working on orthography. It's one of those things where, like, if you're talking about morphemes, you're talking about how they're spelled, so you can't not think about orthography as well. And same with phonology, where it's like it should be, I mean, even though you technically can do phonological awareness activities without talking about print, by the time kids are in grade school, you should be talking about print as well. There's a lot of research that shows that adding that print element does make a difference for our students. So that's how I'd recommend integrating it. Divide and conquer and work it into your therapy as much as possible. And then emphasize those, you can do those direct phonological awareness, blending, and segmentation if you have the bandwidth, but most of all, just make sure somebody's doing it. So that is, we're going to wrap up that part. So the question on phonological awareness, I wanted to move on and talk about semantic feature analysis and the hierarchies. So what I was trying to find, and I know it was posted somewhere in here. It's a manual. I've got it over here. Hold on, let me peek over. All right, sorry guys. Okay, so this one is pretty good. This is kind of old school, but I'm going to show you a link to the other one that talks about the language processing hierarchy. This was by Gail Richards, and if you're familiar with the language processing test, then it is similar to a lot of those things that are assessed in that test, like associations, categorization, things like that. It's a great manual. I'll stick a link in the comments, but and this is something, she actually has a manual aside from the language processing test. Aside from the test, there's a separate manual with therapy activities and goals. The problem I have with that is that it's not very feasible for a practicing SLP because there's like a bazillion goals. And there is no way that a school SLP with 80 kids on their caseload is going to be able to track all those goals. So I think the therapy activities in that manual are fine. It's a great resource that you can have, and I think it would work in well to the things that I teach in Vocab Foundation and Language Therapy Advance, and even the narratives course as well. Having said that, I think there is a simplified way that you can write your goals. So if you are in Language Therapy Advance, any of the versions of that program, in your SPOT manual, I talk about how to write goals. And what I recommend doing for any goals, whether it be semantics or whether it be any area, is start with a very simplified base goal and make variations from there. So with semantic feature analysis, the goal that I start with is student will name 3 to 4 attributes about, or we'll use 3 to 4 attributes to describe a word. Or sometimes I'll say, we'll use 3 to 4 attributes to describe or define a word. And then I work on word defining within that goal. So there are a couple of reasons why I recommend starting with that goal. And one of them is because if you think about it, an attribute of a word, any of those things that are talked about within that hierarchy, associations, categorization, synonyms and antonyms and things like that, all of those are semantic features. So in theory, if you have a goal for defining and describing using attributes, and you have another goal for categorization, because you have to categorize something, like for nouns, a key feature of being able to define a word is having that category. You're kind of double dipping there with your goals, and you're actually making more work for yourself. The reason that I recommend starting with that goal is because it makes it easier for you to track. It gives you a lot of flexibility for the amount of skills that you can target under that specific skill. So let's say, again, you're going to start with associations. You can start with that skill, and then you can work into working on categorization. You don't necessarily have to go through this organized hierarchy. I know that for language, we want that, but the problem with that is that language isn't this neat linear skill. So a lot of times kids are getting exposure to a lot of different skills, and we integrate all of them together, and that's how we learn language. So we don't necessarily need to separate this out and, not work on categorization until they've mastered associations or things like that. So the thing about starting your goal like this as well is that, let's say that you write this goal for them to be able to define and describe 3 to 4 attributes of a word. Let's say you write that in August. They might make progress throughout the year on that goal. And if they're making progress, and maybe they're even working on different things in the curriculum, it gives you a lot of flexibility as far as what words you can target, so you can keep it aligned with the curriculum. And then it also gives you some flexibility as far as being able to target a lot of different things under that goal in order to kind of move through a hierarchy and target different skills throughout the year, and not just be like pigeonholed into one thing. And the way that you actually would take data with that is that, let's say that your student has made progress on categorization for that quarter. You would simply document that under that goal. And the question becomes is that, I know that a lot of times we're challenged where it's like, okay, you can't just keep that same goal every year. How do we tweak it? How I would describe that, when a parent would ask, like, did my kid actually make progress? I would show them the little mini skills underneath that goal. Like, I might say, okay, there are a bunch of different pieces to this goal. Here are the things that they would, here's the data that show that they made progress with categorization. Here's the data that show they made progress with associations and things like that. I would show them that data to show how they made progress from there. Now, let's say that you've been working on that goal for a while, and you've found that your students are struggling with one specific type of attribute. Like, let's say that they really struggle with naming similarities and differences of an item, or naming synonyms and antonyms. You could then, after you've teased that out and worked on that goal for a while, you could break it out and write a goal for naming synonyms and antonyms. But I don't recommend starting off with this massive list of goals and making more work for yourself. So I'd recommend with that goal that is still measurable and objective, because you can identify if a student has named 3 to 4 attributes of a specific word. You can identify if they actually have that skill. That's something you can track. But then what that does is it allows you to keep evaluating within that goal and figure out, okay, which areas do I need to break out? Because if we start with this huge complicated list of goals, it's just going to be really difficult to track. And it's not going to be feasible for you. So that's how I recommend doing that. As far as working through the hierarchy once you've written the goal. So we've got two separate things here. We've got the issue of the goal and tracking it, and then we've got the issue of how do we actually work on the goal. So obviously, again, this is all of the trainings. I believe this is module 2 in Language Therapy Advanced and Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, where I talk about definition syntax. But how I recommend doing it is, I don't recommend doing it in discrete chunks, like, drilling associations cards and then drilling categories cards, because it's just not very functional, and it doesn't necessarily teach students how to use the right syntax in addition to semantic skills. And so what would be better instead is to simply go through and teach all of them at the same time and model all of them. So for example, if you're going to be working on definitions for nouns, what you'd want to do is that you'd want to right off the bat start off with modeling, like, for example, if you're going to do the word dog, like it's a kind of animal and it, you know, it barks, and you go through all of those different specific features in semantic feature analysis, and you talk through all of those with your students. And if they can't do them right off the bat, you're going to have that visual there. And what will probably happen here, especially if you're working with younger students, let's say first grade, it's actually normal for them to not be able to, you know, right like that, name the category. That element of categorization doesn't necessarily come until second grade, is when we would expect kids to be able to really have that solid Aristotelian definition where they'd be able to say an X is a Y that's Z. So what you can do is still work through categorization and give them that opportunity to give you that information. But if they don't get it, you can just simply model it. So it's like you can even model a sentence like a dog is a kind of and sometimes even giving them that sentence starter can help facilitate. And so I just go through and we talk through that entire list of semantic features. And if they don't get it, I would simply prompt them with one of those sentence starters and give them that time delay or that pause to see if they can come up with them at least an approximation on their own. And then I would work through that whole thing. So the thing is that this gives them the big picture and it gives them structure, because a lot of times if you are working on semantics in isolation without getting syntax, kids don't have that structure. So it's kind of like you're dumping a bunch of stuff at them and they don't know how to categorize it. Because remember, a lot of these kids have word retrieval issues. And it's like, you know, you're dumping stuff into a big pile instead of putting it in neat little files or drawers. And so you want to give them those drawers, which is syntax. So that's why I don't recommend doing it, you know, in discrete isolation. However, let's say that you're doing that for a while and you're like, okay, there's this one thing they're really not getting. You know, it would be okay to kind of do a little segue here and be like, okay, let's just work on categorization and kind of, you know, work really quickly, but then come back to the big picture. So when you do those little segues, that's when it's good to integrate some of those, you know, categories cards, that the Gail Richards manual that I mentioned, things like that. So it's always good to have those activities on hand. You can work them in for some additional emphasis on specific things, but I don't recommend staying in that drill and kill isolation, because it's just, you know, again, it's just not functional ultimately. So that's how I recommend doing that. Hopefully that provides some clarification. So everybody, I know I see some people who are live. If you're live, if you've got questions, pop them in the chat. I can answer them as we go. But yeah, so we've gotten through the primary clinical questions, which is phonological awareness and semantic feature analysis, which I think are probably the most common questions that we get throughout the program. So what I'm going to do now to kind of wrap it up the last few minutes here, if nobody else has any additional questions, is that I'm going to talk about the difference between the three programs that I've been getting the most questions about. If you guys have questions about my other programs, then feel free to pop them in the chat, or you can always email me as well. But let me just name them off as right now. I am working on a little page for my website with all these as well, because people have been asking for that as well, but I'll be emailing you guys about that. But number one, we've got Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, and then there's another version that I released that is extended, that's just Language Therapy Advanced. So depending on when you came in, it might have a different name, but really this information is for people who haven't signed up for the specific program, because I know we've got people in a number of different programs here. So we got Language Therapy Advanced, we've got Vocabulary Foundation, we've got the Social Language Roadmap, which is an autism for students on with high functioning autism, and really just any student with social pragmatic issues. It doesn't have to be specific to autism, but that's the most common thing that we talk about in there. And then the Art and Science of Narrative Language, which it shows you how once you have that solid system for really doing your word study that we learn in Vocab Foundation and Language Therapy Advanced, it shows you how to take that to the next level and get out into other settings like the classroom and do some of those carryover and generalization activities that we don't really want to do necessarily until we've established that foundation. But it kind of helps you take that next step if you want to be doing things that are a little more classroom-like and that are, taking all these skills that you've worked so hard to build in Language Therapy Advanced and then giving your students a chance to apply them. And the method that we use to do that is by teaching narrative structure. So let me go back to the other programs that I will talk about. So let's first start with Vocabulary Foundation. So this Vocabulary Foundation and Language Therapy Advanced Foundations are designed to go together. So you don't have to take them in any particular order or take them both, but I offer it that way just so it makes sense for people to kind of figure out how to work through everything. So what we learn in Vocabulary Foundations is just the whole theory and premise behind how we learn words and how that word learning is different for students who have, and I use the term specific language impairment in that course, but obviously now we have other terminology that we would use like developmental language disorder. So again, when I wrote the course, that was still the terminology that was used in the literature. So that's why I've used that in the course, but obviously insert developmental language disorder in there as well with that new terminology. So we want to think about how that is different for those specific populations, because if we don't understand that, all of the strategies that you're going to do don't make sense. I know a lot of people are like, just tell me the strategy, give me the worksheet, give me the materials. But if you don't have that foundation and your understanding, you're not going to be able to explain that to somebody else and advocate for yourself as a professional, and then advocate for your students to get the services that they need. So that's why we cover that in depth there, just understanding how it's different for that particular population and why things need to look different for them within the curriculum, why that standard curriculum just doesn't work for them and why they're struggling. And then we also talk about, to piggyback on that, what it actually looks like. So the different roles of someone who's a special ed teacher versus a speech pathologist and a general education teacher. And the whole purpose of talking about those roles is to help you understand as a speech pathologist how you fit in. And then we talk about how to select words and then how you would get that baseline evaluation of how well your student's able to define and describe words. And I give you some data collection protocols that you can use in order to determine how well your students are able to define and describe words. And then that's where, we leave it at that. And really, I know that we kind of leave it off where you're just getting everything set up so that you can start studying those words in therapy. And for a lot of people, that really provides a lot of clarity as far as, how am I prioritizing what I'm doing? How many words should I be working in? How do I prioritize that words? And I do give you an ebook with a whole bunch of vocabulary words that you can use K through 8, but I also show you how to find additional words. The manual in there isn't to say like, these are the only words that you can work on in 8th grade, but it's just to give you a starting point and to give you some ideas of examples of tier 2 words. It's not meant to be this rigid thing, because as you know, vocabulary growth, it's not something where everybody wants a hierarchy, but that's just not how language works. there isn't something that shows like this is the best set of words for first grade. This is the best set of words for second grade. How I've categorized them is that I have taken those words, rather thinking of it as a way of like, these are the words that students have to learn in first grade. It's more like these are the words that kids are being exposed to based on what we're seeing in the curricular materials at those grade levels. So that means that there's some flexibility in when you can use those words. So I recommend for people, don't lose a lot of sleep over word selection. Look at the curriculum, look at those materials if you're in the course, and pick a couple of words using the criteria outlined in that program to help you figure that out. So that's what we cover in Vocab Foundation. It's how it's different for kids with language disorders, how to define your role, and how to select those words, and then really set you up with your data collection. And then in Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, we go on to the next step. And for this is what a lot of people are looking for, which makes sense. It is my most popular program. What we do in this program is I give you that complete framework for working on vocabulary in therapy, so that you know exactly what to work on and exactly how to cycle through those activities for students with language disorders. So this would be kids who have issues with processing, kids who are struggling to read, kids who might be diagnosed with specific learning disabilities but have speech as a related service. And you know, oftentimes it's also appropriate for kids on the spectrum who have those processing issues as well, even though there are some other things you would need to consider for kids on the spectrum in addition to. But for kids who are really struggling with language processing and comprehension, both auditory and written and reading comprehension, this is your go-to program and your go-to framework. So what I do in the program is I show you how to work through the essential 5, which I say that these are, if you're covering these bases and working that into your therapy, you're really giving your students a complete framework for the skills that they need in order to build their vocabulary. So things like syntax, semantics, morphology, hold on, I went out of order. Okay, phonology, orthography, morphology, semantics, syntax. I sometimes repeat them if I don't say them in a specific order. Sorry, guys. So anyway, so we go through all of those. So really, Vocabulary Foundation is kind of like the what, and Language Therapy Advanced is the how. It is way more, as far as the number, like how long it is. There are 3 hours worth of training. There's 3 hours worth of training in Vocab Foundation, a decent amount of materials. And then in Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, there's about 10 hours plus some supplemental videos. There is an extended version of Language Therapy Advanced Foundations that's 20 hours. That's the one that I launched in January. However, that one's not open right now. What I am opening is for this month is Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. So let me sum that up again. I know that was a lot. Vocab Foundation is word selection, evaluation, and your role. Language Therapy Advanced is your complete framework for word study and treating those school age language disorders tied to vocabulary. So really those specific treatment techniques that give you that complete system. So those are the two main ones that people have been asking me about. However, there have also been some questions about SLP Learning Academy and what that is. So that has a separate Facebook group. And basically what that is that there's not any course modules. The only thing that we do in that program is focus on digging into specific case studies. And the purpose of that is that, you know, if you've gone through one of my programs, you've got the content. What you need at that point is help with that implementation. So what we do on those coaching calls is that you present your case studies and we work through them, and I give you specific action steps. And so it's different than Facebook Lives because we do Zoom calls where we can actually have a conversation. And then there's other people on those calls that are giving feedback as well. So it's, I don't know if you guys have ever used Zoom. It's just a web conferencing software. It's fantastic. Really helps to connect people and work through those tricky cases. So those are the 3 programs. And so if you have questions about any of those, I know that I've given a lot of this information verbally, and we've got a lot of people who like to get some visuals. So what I'm going to share in the chat after I wrap up here in just a minute is I am going to share the language therapy advance, language therapy. My brain isn't working right now. Language processing hierarchy. I'll share a link to that book. Share also another link to a textbook that's been really helpful for determining some the growth of language throughout the school age years. So Marilyn Nippold's textbook, which has been super helpful, another resource for you. And then if you are interested in any of those programs that I mentioned, Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, Vocabulary Foundation, and SLP Learning Academy, then just leave a comment below. Tell me what program you're interested in, and I will send you that information and let you know as far as, how you would sign up and things like that and when enrollments are. So yeah, thanks everyone for popping in this morning. I'm excited that we had a good turnout this morning. I know that this week is, again, lots of people are traveling, but I'm here, and I'm here to answer your questions regardless of that. So thanks so much for everybody who signed in. Look for those links in the comments. I'll dig those up for you as soon as I sign off here. And everybody have a good holiday this week.